a very warm welcome on this very warm Friday evening. My name is Lucy Bradnock. I'm Dean for Research here at the Courtauld, and it is a huge pleasure to welcome you to the Courtauld for tonight's incredibly special event and a really joyful way to end our week, I think, in celebration of this fantastic publication, Artists' Things, Lost Property, just published by the Getty 2024, and jointly authored by Katie Scott, Professor Emerita at the Courtauld, and Hannah Williams, Senior Lecturer in History of Art in the School of History at Queen Mary University of London. And published as this very beautiful hard copy edition. There we go. Paperback. Beautifully. But also, and this is such a treat and such an impressive, I think, indication of the generosity of this project as an open access version that is freely available online and to download. Artists' Things pays close, careful, beautiful attention to a whole array of curious objects and items begged, borrowed, loaned and owned by artists in Paris some 300 years ago. Those everyday things that are often overlooked and often overvalued in history, undervalued in histories of art, but that in Katie's and Hannah's expert hands yield this incredibly rich understanding of artists' relations to their work and to their world, and indeed to the work of the art historian in navigating those material actors. And one of the things that I have found incredibly fruitful as I have begun to explore this book online is the way in which it really encouraged me to reflect on my own practice as an art historian and someone who kind of frequently encounters but maybe doesn't pay quite enough attention to those material objects. It's my huge pleasure to welcome Katie and Hannah, scholars who have so impressively shaped their field. And also to extend my welcome to their two interlocutors this evening, two incredible artists, Christopher Le Brun and Cornelia Parker. And we're so delighted that they're joining us to think together about what we can learn from artists' things in the past and in the present. It's really a dream lineup today, so I think we're all incredibly lucky to be in the room today for this. So Christopher is, as you will all know, and I feel like I am rehearsing biographies and information that will be so well known to many of you in this room, one of the leading British painters of his generation, president of the Royal Academy of Arts between 2011 and 2019, and knighted for his services to the visual arts in 2021. His work, which encompasses both figuration and abstraction, painting, sculpture, watercolour, and print, not to mention several Royal Mint celebratory coin commissions, which feels relevant for today's conversation, offers complex, densely layered meditations on the world, the act of painting in its multiple histories. And those of you familiar with his work will know well the mastery of touch that he brings across those different media, and the dazzling colours and the impressive scale of his paintings in particular. His 4-painting commission, The Seasons, is currently on display at Ladbroke Hall in Notting Hill. But of course his work also resides in all major museums and galleries, including, to name just a very few, the British Museum, the Tate, the V&A, and indeed the Courtauld Gallery. We're also delighted to welcome Cornelia Parker, RA. Parker works, again, across multiple media: sculpture, installation, embroidery, drawing, photography, and film, to investigate processes of transformation and suspension, and to explore the often destructive times in which we live. To demonstrate the importance of process, she frequently transforms found objects by using seemingly violent techniques such as shooting, exploding, squashing, cutting, and burning, to physically alter the object and to activate her own role in its history. And many of us were really lucky to encounter this incredible body of work in her mesmerising Tate retrospective just the year before last. Parker's work and her many, many honours and accomplishments will again be known to many of you in the room, and I will rehearse just a few of them, among them her 1997 Turner Prize shortlist place, her appointment in 2022 as Commander of the Order of the British Empire for services to the arts, and her honorary fellowship at Trinity Hall, Cambridge, also in 2022. She was the UK's official election artist for the 2017 general election, and made several artworks now in the Parliamentary Art Collection. In 2023, she was commissioned by the Government Art Collection to create works in response to the coronation of King Charles III. And so tonight we are in the incredibly lucky position of hearing our four speakers in conversation, reflecting from both historical and contemporary positions as academics and artists on the nature of artists' things. Just before we begin, a few slightly banal housekeeping matters. It is quite warm in this room. We will endeavour to keep the air conditioning on so that we can all not sweat too much. If you need a restroom, our nearest is just outside to the left, with more on the floor below and on the floor above. We're not expecting a fire drill this evening, so if you do hear a screeching alarm, please do follow the directions of our event staff to evacuate the building. We're going to hear from our panel in the form of a discussion and a conversation this evening before we have the opportunity to open out to the audience for questions and thoughts. And from there, we'll make our way towards more informal conversation and discourse with drinks upstairs in the common room. And again, our event staff can lead the way just one floor up. But you've not come here to hear me speaking, so I will pass over now to Hannah. Please join me in welcoming our speakers for this evening.
Thank you so much, Liz. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? No? You can't? Okay. Is that better? Oh, wow. Very close. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on this beautiful sunny Friday evening. We're beyond delighted to be having this conversation with Cornelia and Christopher about artists' things. Obviously, they, as artists, are eminently qualified, presumably artists who own things, they are eminently qualified to have this conversation. Katie and I, not artists, but we have been working for 14 years on this project from a historical perspective, digging into the things that artists in 18th century France owned, cherished, loved, used, needed, in a way. So we wanted to have this conversation in order to have a conversation about sort of the past and present of artists' things. And obviously between 1724 and 2024, art has changed dramatically, and the material culture of our lives has changed dramatically. But I think from the conversations that we've already had, I've been quite struck already by how many more sort of continuities and resonances there seem to be between the historical and the contemporary than maybe some of the ruptures that we might have expected. And the other reason we really wanted to have this conversation is that the whole process of writing this book really sometimes felt like we just wanted to be able to ask our artists questions about why they own something, or where they got it, or where they kept it and what they did with it. And I think one of the questions that I felt in writing the entries that I wrote in the book that really drove each one was thinking about, what does the story of this thing tell us about you as an artist? That was the kind of question I really wanted to pose to my artists. So instead of messing around in dusty archives tonight, we get to speak to real living artists and ask them those questions. And we thought we might kick things off by asking you about the two objects that we asked you, or two things that were on the screen before, and that, I don't know if you both brought. Yeah, no, we have the image, so
I thought I'd be arrested.
Yeah, we were worried because Cornelia's object was a bit dodgy for the tube, so that one doesn't come. But we do have Christopher. So yeah, I don't know who wants to go first. If you could tell us something about your thing.
Well, hello everybody. You've all been enjoying the very blue lapis lazuli. Well, here's the real thing, prepared to be a little bit disappointed. Oh, it's there it is. Now, if I wet it now. Now, the obvious reason is why. Shall I just straight in?
Yeah.
Why did I choose it? When I was a student, there was the chief restorer of the National Gallery was a man called Arthur Lucas. And he was the sort of man who wore matching tie and handkerchief sets. And he'd come in and lecture to us, and at the time there was an enormous controversy about the restoration of the Titian, Bacchus and Ariadne. And Arthur had coloured in the sky with with this stuff. And I think most of the staff at the Slade thought he'd gone over the top on it. It's very, very blue. So if we now come right the way back to 2015, I found myself in Kabul because my son, Edmund, our youngest son, had decided, in the way children do to worry their parents, gone to the most dangerous place on earth, saying, "It's fine, Dad, it's fine." And he was there, and my wife and I went out to visit him. And while we were there, we went to a shop on Chicken Street in Kabul, and we asked to see some lapis, chicken, as in chicken. And the man took us to a back room and opened a door, and there was a huge pile of rocks in the back room, big, little, all sorts of different things. And Edmund bought this as a present, and if you don't remember this, anyone smuggled it back.
In his shoe?
Somehow he got it back. Why it's so resonant for me is partly that memory of being there, and then speculating about the journey that this piece of rock has had in the history of art. Because it comes from Badakhshan province, which is in the far northeast of Afghanistan. It was one of the few provinces the Taliban didn't manage to take before the recent takeover. Lapis from that area has these little flecks of gold in it. And although there's some in Chile, there's little in Russia, little in America, none of it has this quality. And it's all brought down from the mountain on the back of people. It's carried down from the mountain. So so this is both an object of art, redolent of history, and also personal, because it records a family journey.
Oh, lovely. Right. Well, my humble stick of dynamite, which I bought in a car boot sale, I don't know, 35 years ago or something, Hackney Marshes, before the Olympic Stadium was built. And it's been obviously made out of a broom handle that somebody's painted to make a prop stick of dynamite. It's like a cartoon. And I found this before I did my exploded shed, so it's almost like a harbinger of this, what became something real, rather than this is a depicted stick of dynamite, not a real stick of dynamite. But I obviously liked it, in fact it could be mistaken for a real stick of dynamite, and that's why I didn't bring it tonight. Because the political climate is very different now than it was when I first acquired that. I was asked in, I think it was like sort of 1990 something, 5 or something, to do, was given 2 disposable cameras, and 52 artists were going to take 52 photographs or 54 photographs. And so I thought, what am I going to do, for my photographs? So I decided to do a day with dynamite. So I took my stick of dynamite all over the place. I gave it to, I got a policeman to pose with it. Not loud enough. Oh, can you hear? Okay. Julian Clary said, "Are you receiving me in the rear?" Sorry, I diverged somewhat from the object here, where was I? The explosion. So they were dynamite. So I went around London with my stick of dynamite, putting it onto cars, putting it in very, very sort of precarious places.
Well, did you say this was the 90s?
The 90s, yeah. It was pre-September 11th. I think that's when everything changed somewhat. And I was living on a house. No, was it? Yeah, it was a housing. It was the first council housing estate, which is Arnold Circus in Shoreditch, and I lived there at the time. And I remember, there was lots of Islamic graffiti, lots of quite incendiary stuff. But this innocent stick of dynamite was placed in all kinds of places. And I took these photographs, and now looking back on them, they're really quite incendiary. There was one of them was the plumber's mate who was doing some plumbing on our building that we lived in. I just moved out of the flat into a studio place. And he's in the corridor, it's very dark, and he's holding the dynamite. And he's got about 4 or 5 days growth of beard. And he looked very, very menacing, and I called it Matt with dynamite. Whatever the date it was. And I had a show at the Icon Gallery more recently. And remember, Jonathan Watkins, the curator of the show, wanted me to have something. He's the guy I did the Exploding Shepherd all those years ago. So he liked the idea of publishing one of these photographs as the multiple for the Icon. And he chose the one with Matt holding the dynamite. And Matt looked like a terrorist. And we didn't sell a single one. Anyway, there's lots of, this stick of dynamite is now sitting on my mantelpiece.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, it's on my windowsill. My new flat overlooks the overground, so people on the overground trains can see the stick of dynamite in the window.
Keep an eye on.
So anyway, but I think what I like about it is it's a cartoon, and a lot of my work has it stems from early, Charlie Chaplin films or slapstick or cartoon violence, and so this was definitely a catalyst for a whole stream of work.
It's also a prompt, isn't it?
It's a prompt,
for you.
yeah.
Where I think that's where perhaps some of the differences with the 18th century might begin to appear. Because I think we'd be hard pressed to find an object where artists were prompted. I mean, it takes me back to, the tradition must surely be Leonardo's Dan Hall, ultimately, that you see something which prompts an artistic response. Now, your artistic response is obviously very different from Leonardo's, but the idea, if you like, of seeing something out in the world, which then becomes the reason that, and presumably works well with your sense that the studio is not a particular place, but actually a place you take with you out in the world.
A portable place.
Yeah, a portable place rather
I mean,
than a fixed place.
There was a whole series of work I made in the 80s, which was using souvenirs of famous buildings, the Empire State Building, the Eiffel Tower, lots of European cathedrals. And I cast them in lead and made plumb lines out of them, so they were hanging upside down. And I like the idea that great architecture had been reduced to this little crude, cliched cipher, and I was almost turning it on its head and pointing to as all builders use plumb lines. It was like the beginning of something. But so I made that for about 3 or 4 years. I worked in that way. It's my monuments time, and then I started getting interested in silver-plated objects. Because they were monumental somehow in people's lives. They were retirement presents, or they were wedding presents, or it was changing the monumental architecture down to something that we, a silver goblet, or a cigarette case, or So I quite liked squashing those things.
Can I ask about on the lapis? So does it live in your studio as well? And have you ever? Obviously, you're happy to mess around with it and add water to it, but have you ever tried to use it as a thing? Have you ever tried to grind it?
I wouldn't dream of it, because if you over grind it, it just turns to grey mud. So I imagine there would have been assistants in the past who were left slightly too long with the pestle and mortar to come back and discover they'd
destroyed their masters.
No, it sits on a shelf with the usual things, a couple of books propped up and some postcards and things like that. But I'm just hearing you talk about what one carries with you. Of course, I very much can't carry my studio with me. And I was at the Slade. There was my first teacher was somebody called Patrick George, and he was so modest he wouldn't even call his studio a studio. He called it his painting room.
Oh, that's very 18th century.
Yes, I think Constable also called it a painting room. But he maintained that tradition. Whereas now, if you go online to look at artist studios, there is extraordinary inflation in artist studios. They get bigger and bigger and grander and grander.
Yeah. kind of an enshrining of them too, house museums and sort of this
Yes.
something that a lot of people have said to us during the process of writing the book that if you're writing this about the 19th century, you'd have had no problem finding objects that are still attributed to these artists. But for the 18th century, that was a moment before that sort of celebrity of the artist and before the enshrining of the studio, and which made the research task of actually finding things still connected to
Well,
artists.
I found reading the book very touching, because a lot of the objects in there I live with. I recognise exactly what's going on. And when I was thinking what to bring, a chair would have been too big. But actually, these basic items, the chair, the mirror, for example. There was a period when I used to always walk back from my paintings and immediately look in a mirror to check in the clawed glass sense of checking it reduced into tone and back to front, so you can see whether there are any compositional weaknesses in it. So these are things I absolutely share over decades and decades and decades. And my first, when I left school to go straight, I went straight from school to the Slade. I was given a box of paints, which still is a very sentimental thing. It's rather beaten up, and the idea of me using a box of paints now, Connie, one couldn't possibly get one tube out and do a little bit of paint with a palette. It's on a much
bigger scale.
Now.
I mean, the sense that if you like, your lapis can be both historical and technical, I find very interesting, because certainly in the 18th century there were pigments that were valued because of their historicity, because they were associated with what the old masters used to paint,
But also,
and yet equally drawn to
yes.
New developments, and therefore how do you make a decision as to which way
But there
to
is
go?
there's a very important technical aspect here to do with the way that artists paint their pictures. If you're using a pigment that has cost you hundreds, if not thousands of pounds, you will do a drawing before you start your painting.
Yeah.
Now, if you come up to de Kooning, you see on his worktop bowls of paint set out.
Yeah.
Masses and masses of things. So how one would treat one's materials has been, we're lavish really now compared with how precious they are. I remember seeing Bernard Cohen at the Slade once pick up a tube of artist's oil paint, and he did this with his finger just on the top like that. Just treating it with such respect, this tiny little tube of cadmium paint. And I still feel reproached by that memory now as
Yes, you dollop it up.
Well, silver is hardly a cheap medium, and yet it's one of your favourites, really, isn't it? Whether
Yeah.
drawn or squashed or.
I mean, I love silver. What I love about silver is it tarnishes. So you've got this duality. You've got the most reflective metal, which is silver, and then you get this ability for it to go black. So it's kind of, this duality for me is great. And I asked the silver, I used to occasionally get asked to do things like engravings, and if he would keep all the little bits of silver that when he was engraving into solid silver, he'd have all these little shards of silver, swarf, and it wasn't worth that much money, but I asked him to save it for me, so he did, and he had this jar for it. He did keep the gold. He kept the gold shades, because he said he told me this story, which is, was probably an old wives' tale, but this thing about these large silversmiths, and there would be a lot of workers there, and they would basically have brill cream in their hair. And at the end of the day, they would sweep in their hair all the time, and there'd be little specks of gold in it. When they got home, they'd comb it out, and then they'd put it in a jar, and then this jar would be their holiday money.
Yeah.
And I presume that the people who ran the factory probably knew they did that, but it was their little perk, and I just loved that. I thought that was amazing. So anyway, the little tendrils of silver that he collected for me, I call them the negative of words, because they literally were the negative of words.
Yeah.
Because the words are all monumental words, anniversaries, and the same way the monument I was looking at before. It's the idea this was the inverse of the monument. And I've got lots of tiny relics that are not even objects, and I call them avoided objects, but I got a piece of blotting paper, that came from the Hans Christian Andersen Museum, and the curator there gave it to me because it fell off this rocking blotter, and I thought it was tiny and it was so beautiful, and I thought, well, it could have been, the Emperor's New Clothes, or any of his amazing fairy stories could be the negative of it. And so so I've got lots of these little. I've got some Gwendolen Gibbons's Swarf, the carver, given to me by the keeper of the armouries at the Tower of London.
So they're playing almost like relics then, it's a kind of
They're relics.
relic-y
I was born Catholic,
Yeah.
you see, so this was these are my contemporary relics. But they don't fit, they take a tiny amount of space, it's great. I mean, I got feathers out of Freud's pillow, dust out his couch, I've just got all kinds of weird stuff. But they're not necessarily thought of as objects by the director of the Freud Museum at the time. I borrowed the pillow and blanket off Freud's couch to be in the show with Tilda Swinton when she slept with me. It's a collaboration we did together in 1995. And when I was handling the pillow, I could feel these feathers sticking out of it, as you get with feather pillows. And I thought, I was very tempted just to pull them out, but I knew I couldn't do that. So I asked the director of the museum, look, these feathers are halfway out. What happens if they fell out onto the floor
all
of
by
the museum?
themselves.
Yeah, all by themselves. It must happen all the time. And then she said, yes, you can have them. So I was very ecstatic. And I put one of them in a glass slide and I projected it anamorphically along the wall, so it looked like being shot from a bow and arrow. And I called it projection. So anyway, I've got a long history of, photographing creases made by people in the left chairs, all kinds of stuff. But they're not objects; they're kind of.
Well, I'm
fictions.
interested in this kind of, that it turns out that objects and media are not in separate categories. And I think one of the things we found very interesting about talking about artist things was trying to approach them in such a manner that we didn't presuppose those kind of categories in advance, even for an early modern artist. And although I think I'd be hard pressed to find artists who work the way you do, nevertheless, the sense that improvisation, chance, making the most of what's to hand, is a story that can be told at any period. It's just quite difficult to get at. And even knowing
is mattress ticking instead of
exactly. One of his mythological paintings is painted on mattress ticking, and it's his reception piece for the Academy. So
There you go.
and also it's Ronaldo and Armida. So what could be better than mattress ticking for a love
for the lovers?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's those kinds of things that this project has thrown up, and it's rather than already accepting those categories in advance.
Yeah.
And it sort of comes from this idea that in the 18th century, very few artists had separate studios. So certainly there wouldn't have been separate addresses, and probably not even a room in the house that was always functioning as the studio. And obviously that changes a lot in the 19th century. And when we first were talking about this with you, I think we had an assumption that contemporary artists must have studio space, there must be a kind of investment in the studio as a space. But that was one of those moments that I found quite interesting, that there was much more continuity actually about the studio being not necessarily a designated place, but the space where making happens, wherever that happens to be, and it's as much about the objects and the.
But it's also a place of commerce.
Yeah.
I was very. Is that all right? I went to see Rubens' house years ago, and I think I've got this my memory right. As you go in, I think there's a large. I realise I'm looking at a sea of scholars. I'm sure I'm wrong here. There's a large archway, and as you go in, I think his house was on the left, which was a low building in the sort of Flemish style. But on the right was his studio, which was grand with the emperor and philosopher's busts around the top in full classical grand style, and that's where he painted. But that's where he received his guests. Now, I'm lucky enough in my present, I'm not to compare myself with Rubens. However, there are some
How's your chat?
faint similarities. So my workshop room, which is messy as you'd imagine and paint everywhere, is where I do the work. But I do have a clean space opposite, where I take the work to rehearse it going out into the world. So I go into that room and look at it, trying to, and if it's all right, it stays, and if not, it goes back to the painting room. Now, if someone comes to the studio to visit, they come into the painting room first, and only when they're familiar with their surroundings do they go into the clean space to look. Please don't share my tricks here. In the clean space, but then they're then calm enough or can concentrate enough to look at the paintings, you see. So I think this has always happened, and I'm looking at Andreas here, who looks after me at the Listening Gallery, and he's aware of these things, but it is very important. So I think that, my guess is that's always happened.
For artists who sold works.
Well, there would have been a very busy place of a workshop with with quite young boys and girls helping and so on,
Yeah.
and then another place for the clients. This is all before the great late 19th century commercial inventions of the private dealer and so on.
Yeah.
I feel I've worked at home practically for the last 30 years. It started when I had a studio in Leytonstone, which in always short life housing. I lived there for 10 years, and artists would have rooms in their house or the flat where they stayed. People like Grayson Perry and Jeremy Dello and Mona Hotu and I and many others were out there, occupying this space. And those, and then I got very used to working at home and really liked it. And that's when I started to introduce representational things into my work. Before that, everything I did was abstract. But I now use representational things that are almost so representational. They're cliches, and then I can make them abstracted. So I'm finding my way back to abstraction through representation. That wouldn't have happened, I don't think, unless I'd been working at home. And now I'm getting to a point in my life where I've got a lot of storage. I've just got divorced, and I need a space to store work and perhaps make a big mess, because I share my flat. My new flat with my daughter, who I'm sure when she comes back from her gap year will want me to move off and move back to the living room. So I've made the biggest work from the smallest space, let's put it that way. And the space is usually an exhibition space just before a show, and my exploded shed existed, all got made within 3 weeks. It was a very fast sort of process. And I like that. I like making work in a space with a gun to my head, metaphorically speaking, of course, and with a lot of pressure on me, and that's the way I've made work for many years now. It's
how we made this book too.
Exactly. You need a deadline.
Exactly.
And sometimes you don't have that in the studio. I can prevaricate forever in the studio.
Yeah.
I mostly make nothing.
I think we tend to know in the past, the times when we take the studio as a commercial space more seriously is in the context of something like portraiture, where somebody like Reynolds had to live in a smart part of town, and he had to have a particular type of townhouse, and he had to be able to receive people in a way they would expect to be received. You couldn't be in a garret.
They also had to manage their sitters.
Yeah.
I remember someone saying to me once that the reason Iyengar is such a great artist is that he could manage his sitters. He could get them to do what he wanted to do in the time that he set for it. And similarly with Reynolds. I think that aspect of the point at which in France, there's people having the salon at the weekend where people would visit, and the poets would be there, and the composers and fashionable society was absolute necessity. But there must have been continuity in that for artist practice.
I was just thinking about Goya, because Goya's wife was a fabric dealer, I think, and he was surrounded at home with these gorgeous fabrics. And if you go, last time I saw a Goya show, I was looking at the way he painted fabrics.
Oh, the
Amazing.
tapestries, aren't they wonderful tapestries?
Beautiful, and the heads almost like had been stuck on at the end. It felt like he'd had a sitter for a short period of time, but he had the fabrics as his backdrop daily, and he painted them magnificently.
Well, we got very interested in whether, we tend to think of artist dress. Is there such a thing as artist dress? It certainly becomes a thing in the 19th century, but whether there was in the 18th century. So we started looking at portraits of artists, RA portraits of artists and what they were wearing and so on. And one of the artists who gets into the dictionary for his dress, it turned dressing gown, because dressing gowns were thought to be artist dress in the 18th century, or potentially artist dress in the 18th century.
Very louche.
He had investments in the silk industry in New York. So, and it's clear going through the inventory of his clothing that he was a connoisseur of textiles. He knew exactly what he was buying and what they were worth and how he wanted to present himself. But, whether you say that was artist dress, he certainly tries to present himself.
If I wore a silk dressing gown to receive people, they'd be
Horrified.
You don't really go in the clean room, you don't put your silk dress
no, unless I got a paint on it.
But people
That would
have
be all right.
expectations of what they expect you to how they find you, how they expect to find you dressed when they come to the studio.
Yes.
I think people have expectations of artists which are, hundreds of years old somehow. It seems very odd. I mean, people are always saying, we'd like to come to your studio, we want to photograph you in your studio, and I was thinking, I haven't got a studio. They say, they don't believe me, I've got thousands of assistants, I've just got a good project manager. I don't fit into the sadly, I don't fit into the myth of the artists, and it's a bit disappointing for them, I think.
Yeah, but you probably fit better with someone like Rubens, who effectively whose studio, Joanna, but to some extent artists whose studio is the work in situ, and they, their studio is the ceiling they're painting, or
the site
specific.
Because as far as I'm concerned, site-specific painting and sculpture was the very first art form. Think of cave paintings, and all the artifacts that they carved. I think it's very it feels like an artificial thing to have a canvas on a stretcher and not on the wall, not paint on the wall. It just feels like we've evolved in a very curious way. Okay, it's because you wanted a portable thing and not religious paintings. But Magritte, I think I was talking to you about Magritte. Magritte's house in Brussels, he used to paint in the kitchen between, the toilet and bathroom and the living, it's a very small, narrow living room, but that's where he painted. He had a studio at the end of the garden which he used to do graphic art in, which was what he made his money out of. But the studio was, his wife was there and people were coming in and out, and he was just doing it in the kitchen, which was tiny.
When you say that, I always think of Samuel Palmer making the last great etchings, probably just sitting at a table. There's terrible copper that kept curling up, and but in quite reduced circumstances. I mean, I've been to so many studios in my life which have been overpoweringly big, where the message of the studio is as important as the message of the work. And I tried to have a very big studio once. I had a studio in Peckham on Asylum Road. It was an entire floor, very appropriate, entire floor of a factory. And I was forever losing my cup of coffee. It was ludicrous. I made bigger and bigger and bigger work, and I'd exhausted myself on it, which is ridiculous, because in the end it's a bit like visiting a stately home to discover that Lord and Lady thingy live in the tiny,
They always do.
just off the kitchen, with all the little it's just human.
Well, they did. I mean, many of the studios, of course, that we studied were ones that were in the Louvre. So they were ones that the studios were given lodgings by the state. And a lot of the competition there was about the kind of work that you were making that would justify you having the particular kind of space that you were given. So, sculptures on the ground floor, always with access to the courtyard so they could do something with the materials. And then, something like Vermeer trying to negotiate on the grounds that he had a large commission, that he should have a large space. Doesn't always work, but they certainly try to. Yeah.
And I'm going to see on Sunday, I'm going to go and visit Rose Wiley, who's a wonderful painter and a friend, and we're just going down there for the day, and I've been quite a lot of times before. And she works at home in the house. She's everything's encrusted with paint, including the TV. She often paints things from the TV, like Tarantino's, film. She likes those. But she makes these paintings which are, they're huge, aren't they? But she did one that was like 18 feet long or 20 foot long, made in panels. So she makes them in panels, but she puts them all together. And I did an in-conversation with her at the Tate, Britain, once, about her work, and she'd given me all the questions to ask. One of the questions was why I shouldn't take commissions. And I think this very glamorous couple, woman with, sort of lots of enhancement, and her husband wanted her to do a painting of them as a couple. They really liked her work. Anyway, this commission went on for about 2 years, and in the end, she painted numerous paintings, none of them were with them in it. They had legs sticking out from the side. They were brilliant. The biggest one was this 20-foot long one made in segments. And they literally were reduced to the background, and then she painted all this other stuff which she wanted to paint. But I just thought it's the most hilarious commission I'd ever seen. But, scale's not been a problem to her by working in a domestic space.
Yeah.
But actually, that reminded me, because the Francis Bacon triptychs. When I was with the Marlborough Gallery for a time, and the delivery driver who collected my work was the same delivery driver who collected Francis Bacon's work. And the reason the triptychs were that size is because if he was at the top pushing with his, he was at the bottom pulling, and Francis was at the top pushing with his foot, they would just squeeze down the staircase. You see, well, you imagine them with the plate glass and the gold fittings now, but they were originally just canvases that could just about go to you a bit,
It was a big footprint at one point. And I was thinking about William Blake as well. Everything he made was on a microscopic scale, and he wasn't very well off, was he?
Yeah, no, I mean, scale obviously, is an issue.
Or Kiefer.
Well, the Kiefer studio, as you know, is very big. You're given a bicycle, and he says, "Come on," and off you go, wobbling away on the bicycle. And the studio is so big that he can rehearse entire museum exhibitions inside his studio. It used to be what's the big French supermarket? It was one of those. It was a warehouse on the edge of Paris.
Wow, amazing.
But it was full of work.
I mean, before we move on to, we thought we might also talk about institutions.
Yeah.
And I just one last observation that objects very often we found very difficult to know whether they belong to the domestic space or the studio space. So so something like handkerchief. When does a handkerchief become a cloth?
A rag.
Yes,
A rag.
I mean, you do a lot of cleaning as part of your processes.
I like collecting tarnish.
Yeah.
It's not an object tarnish, but nobody wants it. I take their tarnish.
You take their time.
And their reflected glory of, whoever, Charles I's spurs or whoever's things I'm polishing at the time. There's a weird fetishism.
No, I mean, I'm all for weird fetishism. I'm not sure whether, I was trying to think whether there's an 18th century equivalent, but something like wax painting, which comes in as a fetish, obsession that's trying to create a particular kind of medium for painting in the mid-18th century because they thought the ancients had used it and it's a cheap material that nobody wanted. Yeah. And so all of a sudden it becomes something that people start exploring.
Wax has reminded me of a slightly fetishistic desire I had once. thrones. You probably don't.
Come on, come
Shall I just show
You're
you?
amongst friends.
So when
Professional.
at the Royal Academy, I'd always been told about various myths about it. One, that the president came with a Rolls Royce, which was
Too late.
RA1, but then I discovered that Richard Attenborough owned that, so that was out. But I also, that there was a throne that had been designed for Thomas Lawrence. So I think Mark from the Royal Academy is here. So on perhaps my first day, I said, "Oh, where's the throne?" And they said, "Oh, wait. Oh, look at that," and tried to distract me. And a year later, I said, "Where's the throne?" And eventually, I discovered there was a throne, but it was so frail that they were worried about me sitting on it.
You would have done.
Yes. Obviously, all that sort of thing had gone away. So when I left, they gave me a tiny wax model of Lawrence's chair in a bell jar.
Oh.
It's about that big.
You couldn't sit on it though.
So I stare at it and think of what could have been.
Of course, Hannah and I are haunted by the French Revolution, which means that so many of the traditions that existed originally for our institutions no longer do. So, hearing about the RA and the RA dinners and the regalia that you wear, or it's all, it gives...
Nothing like the French. The French were embroidered. They have a sword.
That was Napoleon, that can
Yeah, but they still, the academicians still have a sword.
Yeah, that's true. It's true, they do. Even their models were allowed swords.
So the things that we, as the institutional side, the role the institution played has changed a lot. But in 18th century Paris, you couldn't professionally be an artist unless you belonged either to the academy or to the guild. So you could be an amateur artist, but you couldn't be a professional artist. So the institution was crucial in a way that since that time it's become almost the opposite. The artist becomes sort of a symbol of independence and freedom, and art has become an expression of something much more personal and much less sort of state, much less establishment. So the things that we found for the academy were the document box. So these are kind of quite ceremonial objects. It looks like an ordinary kind of leather box, but they kept all the letters patent and the rules and regulations, and every year at the first meeting, the secretary of the academy would come in January and read aloud, open the box and read aloud the rules and regulations that everybody had essentially signed up to by becoming an academician. And so that's quite a formal object. Then the funeral book here, this was a book that had a scrapbook kept by the concierge of the academy, and every time a member died, there was a printed ephemeral kind of invitation to the artist's funeral, and the concierge pasted them into this book and essentially created
it's quite explicit, isn't it? The clue is in the image.
The cover.
Yeah.
But they listed things like their RA membership in their inventory. So if you go through an artist's inventory and you go through their papers, one of the first things that will come up is the parchment of their membership of the...
Well,
what's
it called? Is it Roll of Honour? The most recent one has just been given to Tony Cragg, 20 years late. No, 25 years late, because Tony became a member in about 1994, and the current president, Rebecca Salter, gave it to him in his exhibition at Castle Howard at a little dinner.
So what is it now? A scroll?
Well, no, what's crucial about it is the Queen used to sign them in batches. You see. So there's a chance. There's a chance that Queen Elizabeth signed Tony's one.
Even though
Could you roll down what this is? Because the letters just there, that's Rigaud's, it's the equivalent of that, which is it's a kind of copy, a contemporary copy made then. But it was one piece of paper folded over with.
Where have you put yours?
Exactly.
I was going to make something out.
Oh no!
I'm not going to tell
I
you
think that would be perfect.
I was going to do something quite, I'm not going to tell you.
What about yours, Crystal?
It's in the loo, of course. But it's sitting next to something which is probably just as rare. It's dated 1956, and it shows I'm a member of the Dinky Toys Club. And there's two little boys in shorts looking just like me as I would have at the time. And it's my Wall of Honour, there we are. So it's the sort of life we lead now.
Can I just talk about the Foundling Hospital?
Yes, of course.
Because I was a Hogarth Fellow at the Foundling Museum a few years ago, and I didn't know what to do at all. You know, you're supposed to make something like an event or contribute in some way. And I was reading about Hogarth, and I realised that there was nowhere for any artist to exhibit in his day. You know, there wasn't the Royal Academy then. And so he invited artists to come and exhibit at the Foundling Hospital, which had acres of space. And the Foundling Hospital looked after not orphans, but children who had to be given up by their mothers. And in exchange for a token, there was a token left with the child to identify the child, because most of the mothers couldn't read or write. There was a lot of gin being drunk in that time, in the Hogarth's day. And so these children were almost like gin orphans in a way. But all these artists of the day, including Reynolds, showed at the Foundling Hospital. A lot of patrons came to see it, a lot of rich people, and they did very well. I think they sold loads of work. They gave work to the Foundling Hospital, and that was the beginning of the discussions that became the RA. It was the artists meeting together and realising how good it was that they all had each other to exhibit with, and they should form a kind of association or a club. Or Hogarth was not part of it. He was, I'm not quite sure, I think he fell out with them or something. But Handel played, his Messiah was played there for the second time in the chapel. He'd been played somewhere else, the premiere, but nobody gave it any interest. But suddenly, with all this attendant great and good, he became a star. So this place became a real wonderful place. So I decided I was going to make an exhibition at the Foundling Museum called Found at the Foundling. And it was all about the found object. And there was various artists, about 75, 80 artists in it. But so people could either contribute a found object that they had kept, like your lapis lazuli, or they'd had found objects in it. An example is like Thomas Heatherwick, for example, gave 2 silver spoons which had been ground down by his grandmother, stirring, making gravy and sauces, and the friction that he just kept these 2 spoons for every life. Jeremy Deller had a letter, it was a report card for John Lennon, which, from his school, which was all full of the bad things he'd done, all the dog. So that was very funny. And one of the best things I liked the most was Ron Arad had a long string of tickets. There was a hook, and the tickets, it's a pawnbroker's, and it was from 1955, it's the year of his birth anyway, and he found it in a skip, and there was hundreds and hundreds of tickets on it, and almost every one of them was for a wedding ring, which was a really poignant object, and he had that hanging outside the rooms, all the tokens. So that was I had about 25 RAs in it, just to give a nod to this is where the RA had its origins. But I like the idea of it's about the found object.
Yeah. Well, I can't say that any of us found objects, but they're found by us as a way of trying to find a different way of talking about artists, which is not so dependent on artists' lives. And we were very struck by contemporary artists' lives hardly ever mentioned the material culture in terms of specific things. And yet, on the other hand, we had these inventories of artists, which listed hundreds of objects that belonged to them. And so it started off in ways as an interrogation between these 2 very different ways of thinking about artists and trying to think about their engagement with the world that they wish to represent in one way or another by making that intersection.
Almost thinking about the life of the artist less as the grand events that affect the way that what kind of art you're making, and more about the everyday experience and the practicalities of doing that making.
I
think we've reached a moment to ask our audience whether any of you would like to ask our guests questions that have come out of this discussion. You're not forced to.
Yes, you are.
But it would be great if
Not
you did.
leaving this room.
Yeah, look, we've got some. This is Joanna Woodall.
Thank you for that fascinating question. I just wanted to ask you whether you think artists have a different relationship to things from other people. I'm not going to talk about ordinary people, but other people. So do you think there is a different relationship, or what context or circumstances make a difference?
Layered question. And for me, because I'm a sculptor, I think it's very natural to collect stuff, and it's almost like my alphabet, really. So collecting that stick of dynamite all those years ago, I never dreamt that I'd make a work with real explosives, for example. But no, I just think they're catalysts for thoughts, and I have almost like a visual, a physical sketchbook. Very often they're souvenirs, curious things you picked up somewhere to remind you of the place you've been. I don't know if it's any different for a normal person who hasn't chosen such a weird career for themselves.
If I think of my studio and how it prompts me, so whether any things in the studio prompt me, I'd probably say an ideal studio would have absolutely nothing in it at all, because what I'm trying to do is to make something new, you see. So, the famous Ezra Pound thing about out of which things, getting rid of all the 19th century clutter, the clutter of the rooms and the so, and the great dream of modernism, which is actually rather brutal, which to empty everything out and start again, the white space where we show our work. So I think I still I have a notion of starting afresh all the time, starting afresh. What can make me feel new and fresh? What can be pleasurable and not full of nostalgia? But of course it creeps up on you in a way you can't control your dreams.
Your paints and your brushes and your palette, I mean those things that are allowed, close to you and that are allowed in that cleaned out presentation space that you're talking about.
Well, they must, of definition, be very unself-conscious. They mustn't be too self-conscious. But something that did occur to me, I'm not quite answering your question, but parallel to it, is that question of how long things last.
Yeah.
Because I think looking at many of these objects, they had a continuity through several lifetimes. That's very rare for us now. Yeah. And I think humanly we miss it. And I think it makes us sad when we can't reuse things. And I think there is a value here, which at the Royal Academy, one is terrifically aware of all the generations and younger generations mixed up. And I have a horror of substitution, but I have a love of continuity. And we're very hooked on substitution. That's not a human value. So that's quite a complicated way of reaching back into your question, but I don't...
There's somebody over here.
And one over there.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about type of book, and how do you explain this relationship between art things and lost property? What are you implying? I mean, is all art property? Is it about loss? Is it? I'd be interested here.
Do you want to, shall I go? Or you go? It's a bit of fun, I have to say. Lost property is, that's what historians do. They're always looking for lost property. It's the stuff that we're having to reconstruct because it hasn't survived, whether, in the realm of conceptual ideas or whether it's in the realm of physical stuff. So to some extent, it's a play on some play on the idea of lost property and what, as historian, and part of it, the refinding was our feeling that students always say to you, oh, I can't do this research project because there isn't any evidence. And our robust response to that is that there is evidence, it's just not what you're looking for. So change what you're looking for. And the lost property that's recuperated here is the property for which evidence existed, but we felt had not been adequately looked at. So it's more to do with the way that the project worked, rather than to do with whether or not you could call everything in the book property as such. There are objects for a start, there are animals in the book which you would be hard-pressed to call property by our definition. Dog, nightingale, but there are also objects there are things that were owned by more than one person at one time, so they're collectively owned or collectively used. That, property, I agree, is perhaps not the right word, but it just, lost property seemed to be, what we were doing, what we were trying to do.
And I'm certainly not saying that all art is property. The property that we're referring to are these everyday objects in the material culture of people's lives, their possessions.
And mostly people have a possessive relationship to them, even if they are dogs or relics. Yeah, exactly.
Well, about 30 years ago, I published a book called Lost Property, so...
Oh, wow. I look forward to hearing about it.
But in particular, I guess Cornelia helped. Material memory seems to be something that comes up in your work. The bullet paintings, you talked about the tarnish and those turn backwards, something like that. And I guess, all artists have that material memory sometimes.
I think materials to me are really important, and sometimes I collect things as a material, and I've got all these letters, for example, one by Bette Davis, one by Lenny Bruce, I've got, sort of 1700s love letters, I've got all kinds of curious things. I don't know if I'm ever going to use them in the work, or they're just things I liked having. But I think I've always been very, since childhood, because I worked in a small holding and did a lot of things with my hands, which was, planting vegetables or stringing up tomatoes or mucking out the pigs or milking cows by hand. I was doing a lot of physical labour, repetitive labour, which wasn't play. Children spend most of their time playing, but I didn't seem to have any time for playing. I was trying to do all these chores. Anyway, but which most of them I didn't mind doing. I was a surrogate boy and 3 girls. But I think I've always had this thing about materials and touch and intuition, and if I'm drawn to a material, I just don't, I trust it. I just allow myself to do whatever it is that I need to acquire. For years, 2 or 3 years, when I left college, I earned money by selling junk in Portobello Market in Camden. And so I had a lot of objects pass through my hands. And then when I moved from Reading to London, and I lived in a place which I thought was going to be knocked down from a motorway a few months later, so I didn't really want to accrue too many things. The silver-plated object I bought for my stall ended up going into my work. That it was very funny that this material that found its way slowly into from being just possessions, I was buying and selling things, and I like doing that. I still like shopping more than I like anything else. Usually, antique markets or Amazon. So in a way, I'm sort of think shopping is very important.
You reminded me of something I noticed that artists kind of take up on things that end up in the junk pile. Like once they become they lose their functionality, they lose their polish, whatever, they're in the market, the flea market. You know?
Yes.
And then artists begin to get interested.
I mean, I was, you know, I was I've got loads of brass band instruments. You know, I've done various 2 pieces of brass band instruments, and I'm not going to throw them away. I've got to do something with them, but I'm going to have to squash them. But they are instruments at the end of their life. You know, I'm not bought an instrument, or a trumpet, or trombone, or whatever, unless it's just about to die anyway. So it's a last gasp, because I'm interested in things just about to be discarded or end up on a pub wall. I rush in and rescue it.
And I was thinking that Cassadine or Justice or things like that, who are collecting analog photographs,
Yeah.
or postcards, and nobody sends postcards. So,
I used to collect old encyclopedias and now I could satiate myself with Wikipedia.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question. There is one.
No, I enjoyed that very much, thank you. I had a question about relics. Obviously, in the past, people used to go out and find very specific relics that they wanted to acquire. Is there a relic, inverted commas, that you would like to possess?
I possess so much already. I don't know. I think I wouldn't mind having the Turin shroud. I know it's a bit big to be a relic. I think it's one of the most fascinating objects. Not because it's supposed to be a shroud of Jesus, but just all the layers of history it has. The fact it was in a casket, it was folded up, and it was in a silver casket, it was in a monastery, there was a fire. The fire melted the casket onto the shroud, burning holes, Rorschach of holes in it. And then the nuns made little patches for it. There's always stains in the water they've thrown on it, to put it out. And that's before the Jesus bit. So yes, but it's a bit big, I know, to be a relic.
I recently went to Turin and I have the fridge magnet, so
What about you, Christopher? Do you have
Is there a relic?
an obsessive object that you would like to have
Well,
over-invested?
I think years ago I started collecting prints and things. Sorry, this is turning back into art as things, but they meant a lot to me. But I'm at a stage in my life now where I want fewer things and a bit more space and time. So.
Well, that sounds like a good place.
There's one more.
Okay,
I wondered when you mentioned the Titian and your lapis lazuli.
Yeah.
What was the result of the darkness of the paint on the picture that you were investigating?
I think the controversy was over his use of pure lapis, which gives the sky of the Bacchus now a very intense blue. And if you take the different policies, is this recorded? Broadly speaking, there is a difference in approach between the Louvre and the National Gallery. And I think the feeling was maybe at least one layer of glaze might have just knocked it back a touch. Particularly since Titian's reputation as a Venetian artist was all about the softness, glow, Giorgione type of poetry in the way the painting recedes. Not that it marches up to you and confronts you like that. So I'm not expressing an opinion, clearly, but nevertheless. Can you picture what I'm talking about? Do you know the painting?
Well,
I'm sure
I
you
do, but I'll look at it much more carefully next time.
Okay, well, I think that's we're coming to a conclusion here, and Hannah and I just have a couple of thank yous. We wanted to thank the Courtauld Institute in particular because it's It is here that the project was initiated and largely conducted. And we're very grateful that you've also hosted this launch, given that both Hannah and I have moved on to other pastures since then. But of course, our greatest thanks are to Cornelia and Christopher. This has been such a wonderful occasion for us. And thank you so much for coming and for being so willing and up for answering rather strange questions from us in relation to this project. So please join me in thanking them with a show of hands.